Welcome. I'm Dave Milham. I'm the Chief Architect for the TM Forum, and I'm delighted to be invited today to present to you at the Layer 123 World Congress the preliminary work that we've been doing on cloudification of operation support systems and business support systems in the TM Forum. This work in the TM Forum was as part of a general study we were doing on communication service provider transformation studies, and specifically is focused on the cloudification issues for business support systems and operation support systems. The work was initiated at our Action Week Lisbon event earlier this year, with a number of our members shown here on the right-hand side from the service provider community, in the middle from the cloud community, and on the left-hand side from the OSS BSS community. And what was determined was that most communication service providers are trying to address two issues simultaneously and are hoping to do this with the use of cloud-based solutions. The two areas are agility and cost savings. And to achieve this, one needs to be able to concurrently carry out transformation and also adopt new technologies and new techniques. The focus that we identified was for the use of cloud for BSS and OSS, and later in the year we will be looking at the cloud implications for network-based services such as IoT, edge, and network function virtualization. But for today, the primary focus of the results is in this area here. What we found was that the interest for service providers came from a number of internal drivers, specifically reducing development and capital costs, modernising and streamlining OSS BSS applications, accelerating innovation and new services, and rapidly deploying new technologies. All of these were actually enablers for improving customer experience in the areas of self-service, supported by full automation of processes and massive simplification in the operations of modern OSS and BSS solutions. The motivation for this guide was to address CSP, cloud provider, and independent software vendor needs. And the challenges that were identified was that all of these parties are trying to rationalize BSS and OSS effectively and systematically, and all are interested in moving to the cloud whilst adopting cloud principles. Without an industry roadmap on BSS OSS cloud transformation, we see a number of characteristics that stakeholders are working per project on how to transform, and potentially every transformation project is completely different, having no common elements. That means all stakeholders are saddled with the customization efforts and delays associated with inventing the transformation method for each and every project, which can be quite numerous. With a roadmap and best practices, particularly in the form of checklists, which are highly usable, reuse of best practices can minimize the per project customization, and it can deliver a systematic, repeatable transformation at scale and over multiple waves of transformation. The inspiration behind this was a cloud adoption framework proposed by Microsoft, which was for transformation of all IT workloads onto cloud-based solutions. But what we discovered was that there are some specifics associated with OSS and BSS which do need to be addressed and documented. We decided early on to focus on the earlier phases of this framework, as this is where most service providers are. And we also were aware that some of the downstream aspects, there are a very wide range of choices here, and it wasn't so obvious that there was going to be a clear-cut case for developing specific checklists in those specific areas. Now, although this shows a waterfall-based model, in practice, the strategy, planning, and readiness aspects are developed concurrently. The transformation guide that we developed comprises really of two parts. One is the building of the transformation framework, which takes for its inspiration the thinking in the cloud adoption framework, and also the execution aspects. We have quite a bit of work being conducted in our transformation programs on digital operations transformation, which covers things like culture, organization, people, and skills transformations. And we restricted ourselves in this work to predominantly the strategic planning and business readiness assessment for cloud-based services, and also providing supporting checklists and case studies. So that's the material shown here on the left-hand side. However, we do know that the checklists that are used during the building of the framework can also be used for the individual dimensions or project work items when you actually execute this stuff. And in fact, these checklists can be used as part of the governance structure for driving multiple concurrent execution activities. In defining the scope of the strategy, essentially what all service providers are doing is trying to define a cloud adoption and migration strategy. And they need to take on board the cloud deployment models that they are considered using. And this is influenced by the technology and domain imperatives that they have, standard cloud practices, and the key partners that they've identified that they wish to work with. Also, there are business imperatives that have to be factored in, particularly in the form of the measures and measuring what success looks like. The TM Forum contribution in this area is historically some work we've done on business models in TR 211, and also the work that I mentioned earlier on digital organizational transformation in IG 1200. What we're adding in this document is the additional elements in these items that are needed for OSS and BSS transformation. One thing we discovered early on, there's quite an interplay between the cloud providers and the BSS vendors, and there are different business models for how these services can be delivered to communication service providers. And whilst we've identified these models, we've studiously tried to make certain that our approach and checklists do not assume any specific business model between the cloud service provider and its cloud providers and its BSS OSS vendors, or between the cloud providers and the BSS OSS vendors. Here's an example of some of the public cloud policies that a tier 1 operator might consider adopting. Public cloud first for non-network workloads could be quite contentious, and indeed we had quite a bit of debate around what public cloud means in this context, and more on that later in the summary. Security controls were important, and we decided we'd defer that work until the next phase, when we'll be able to bring in some work on security from our open digital architecture. But a specific requirement of OSS and BSS is the integration with the network technologies that communication service providers have, which isn't typical of what you would see with general IT workloads from other industry sectors. And there are specific issues around deployment governance and cost management and optimization, which are important and need to be managed as part of the strategy. If you look at the strategic goals for a tier 1 operator, what might be typical is a multi-year migration of the existing systems and applications to cloud, and a typical number might be in the order of 4 years. And for a large tier 1 operator, you might be looking at more than 7,000 applications that need to be considered for migration. So what we're discussing here is an at-scale transformation challenge, rather than just being a single system and over a limited period of time. And the kinds of goals that would be set are to set out a goal of 80% of the workloads will migrate to cloud within that 4-year time window, and that there will be a 75% reduction in allocated computing and memory resources. And the key takeout from this is that this is a problem at scale, and scale needs consistency of analysis over an extended period and over a large numbers of applications and systems. And the analysis larger than one team can handle. And because the timescales are extended, you may have different staff performing different analyses at different points in the migration plan. For a tier 1 operator, this example implies more than 400 transformation analyses per quarter at a minimum, and more if the transformations are done in stages towards a cloud native. Even for a tier 1, tier 3, is likely to be going through more than 100 of these analyses per quarter. And this is what really drove us towards thinking about how we could systematize this with the use of checklists. So what we've done is, once the strategy is being built using some of the checklists and decision matrices that we've provided, the individual operator will need to work at the technical options for transforming an existing system into one or more cloud-based applications. And that requires an analysis of the as-is situation in order to determine what the to-be situation might look like. That allows us to then identify the organizational impacts, which we'll describe later, which can be per system and per cloud technology layer service. And that then creates the cost basis or the cost line items that allows individual service providers to carry out CapEx and OpEx assessments of the benefits of moving an individual system or application to being cloud-based. This particular framework, therefore, is focused on checklists and guides in this particular area, and we don't attempt to provide any cost recommendations other than what items need to be included in the cost assessments. What we produced is a three-part document, which consists of a document describing the transformation planning and execution. It includes normalized definitions of what some of these terms actually mean, and it also provides decision matrices for establishing what options are technically feasible for transformation. We've got a second part, which has got a checklist library, which has a series of checklists in it, which are used both as part of the planning and the execution processes. We'll say more about those in a moment. And we've got a pipeline of case studies that we're working on with our members. We have one in the first release, which we managed to get through all the press office issues, and we'll have more in the later releases. So looking at readiness assessment, the key challenge is the as-is situation of a very large number of systems. And as we mentioned, you might have a very large number of thousands of systems to do this, and you're looking to make quite substantial savings. What we've produced is actually some assessment checklists which handle the as-is situation and also the 2B situation. But what we also identified was that the 2B situation can have several possible outcomes. And these are the typical ones that we've identified. One is, as part of an application rationalization program, you might actually just shut a system or an application down. That would be typically the case where that was managing, say, for example, a network technology that you plan to retire. It probably wouldn't make sense to move it to the cloud. It's probably better to let it just disappear when that technology that it's supporting gets to its end of life. We also find that there's a number of systems where the functionality of those systems is quite stable over time, the workload is quite stable, and it's quite doubtful whether full cloudification makes sense. And in those cases, what we've seen is mostly a move towards putting the application on some kind of cloud infrastructure, but not actually transforming the application. A more common case is around rationalization of the systems. This typically happens where you might have multiple systems performing similar services, such as CRM systems for different market sectors. And you might take the opportunity here to replace, say, 3 or 4 of those by a single system, which might be one of those that you've got extended, or it may be by a completely new system, which covers all of the work market sectors that you're trying to cover. But the most common case is actually where you need to modularize and optimize the systems that you actually have. And this requires a multi-stage transformation. And we've captured this in the checklists that we've put together. So the as-is assessments that we have include as-is assessments, and these are mostly based on the constraints that you will encounter if you have 2-tier, 3-tier, or N-tier based solutions deployed at this particular point in time. That will set some constraints about what the available technical options are onto 2B side. And we've created a series of decision tables for the 2B and some supporting checklists that allow you to identify which of the possible outcomes shown here are feasible from a technical point of view for transformation. The next piece is a little bit interesting because it's about recognizing that there's a general trend to move from on-premises and data center responsibilities towards something which is more like a serverless or SaaS-based approach. So we're on a kind of a path as an industry from doing it all ourselves to some kind of relationship with cloud service providers and a changing relationship with operations support system and BSS system vendors. And it shows here that the containerization might occur at any point in this migration. What's really interesting are these technical cloud layer capabilities that are shown here, or responsibilities. And what's happening as you move from an on-premises data center based model towards a cloud model is that the service provider is moving capabilities and functionality they have within their organization and their operational processes, moving some of those to their suppliers whilst retaining others. And I would point out at this point that the responsibility for data always lies with the service provider, communication service provider, even if they use staff from some of the vendors or they use tools from the vendors. The responsibility for that data will always lie with the communication service provider, which means that these operational processes generally have to be retained in all circumstances. What we did is we produced a series of examples of how this might look, a division of the responsibility between the communication service provider and their vendors. And we've created technology service layer checklists, which allow for consistency for assessment of what the responsibilities of each of these layers implies. And this allows you to identify the cost items that each service provider currently performs if they're performing an on-premises based approach, and therefore what items would be moved to the suppliers depending on which of these assumptions, which of these particular business models the service provider chooses to go with. This is quite interesting because it provides the basis for the cost analysis. So we've got an initial starter list of checklists which cover the cloud technology layer responsibilities, and we found that these are being used both for the planning and readiness assessment, and they're being used to identify which responsibilities are retained by communication service providers, the responsibilities that are being passed to the vendors and therefore should be present in the vendor RFXs and responses, and they also provide the line items for total cost of ownership and benefit calculations to determine which of the technical options is most favourable at which pace, at which point in the transformation. And during execution, these checklists can also be used to track the results and check that things aren't being missed in the actual execution of the project that might have been addressed in the strategy planning but have actually just got dropped at some point. So in summary, the learning points that we've come through on this activity is that we had a lot of discussion around the terms public and private cloud and also hybrid cloud, which caused a huge amount of confusion amongst our stakeholders, because different stakeholders were referring to these terms as relating to the location of the cloud technology, the supplier of the technology, the security policies that were being put in place. And we resolved that amicably across the three stakeholder groups. That's the communication service providers, the OSS BSS vendors, and the cloud service providers, with some definitions that I've shown here. We're also aware that security for cloud is quite different from security in traditional systems. We need to move to a model based on software-defined perimeters, which is based on the idea of components with zero trust as the starting point, rather than the historical physical perimeter model, which is based or characterized by the use of terms like red and green zones and DMZ type zones. What we're also learning is that we need to get more case studies in. The more case studies we bring in, the more we learn we need to go into checklists and the way we improve the way in which the checklists are written. And we also will use those case studies to validate that the process that we've identified is appropriate, the right scope, and at the right level of detail for the communication service providers. As I mentioned before, security and privacy is known to be an important issue, but we decided to defer it to the next phase. Now that we've got an understanding about what the transformation best practice is about. The key issue is that security needs an understanding of the BSS and OSS applications and the risks to them. And this is already being described in one of our documents in our open digital architecture work called ODA Enterprise Risk Assessment. And it is specific to the OSS and BSS industry and identifies the threats and the mitigation mechanisms for OSS BSS functionality. We're planning to use that work together with some more embryonic work in a governance and security vision document and a draft document we're about to put out to our members on a model-driven approach to security and privacy framework, which is based on how do you mitigate the risks in OSS and BSS. And we'll eventually input that into an open digital architecture security implementation guide. As I mentioned earlier, business continuity came up as a really important issue. And one of the things that we're quite clear about is that as part of the technical options, we need to add in some additional checklist items on business continuity, particularly as you're transitioning from a wholly traditional based on-premises approach to a wholly based virtualized or cloudifized approach. Now, to move this all forward, we'll be running some further virtual workshops with our members to gain consensus and improve checklists. We want to reach out to those that couldn't participate in each of the weekly calls and get their feedback. And we're also going to establish whether network cloud needs additional work, and that'll probably be conducted as part of a study that we're doing on edge computing and the services and the management of those services that are enabled by edge computing. And with that, I'd like to thank you and pass you back to the moderator. So with that, I'd like to pass you back to the moderation. I'd be happy to take some questions as you see fit.